some sort of identity crisis. Mine is congenital. My parents are here. My mom and dad, like many of you, are visiting from Canada. They were born in Europe during the war. My father was born in Czechoslovakia, as it then was. My mother was born in Vilna. And they went there several, they didn't know each other until 20 years later, but my mom grew up in the Soviet Union in Stalin and in Holocaust Russia. My father's family escaped Czechoslovakia in 1949 when the communists took over through Vienna, wound up in Montreal. Statistically speaking, I shouldn't be alive, but I am. They met in a Hebrew language school in Opan, in Netanya, and my dad spoke English, I guess some French, German, maybe some Hungarian. My mom spoke Russian, a little Lithuanian, a little Polish. Thank God for me, they didn't speak the same language, or else I wouldn't be here either. But that lack of real communication enabled them to court, get married, and we celebrated 50 years last year. So, thank you. So, the reason I'm sharing that is to tell you a little bit about the perspective that I bring to all of this. And those of you who were here last year, we had a series called The Story of Israel, People, Place, and Politics. And I tried in the course of 6 weeks to run through really some of the key points of Jewish history, which is extremely difficult to do. You can't do that in 6 years. We have such a rich, robust history punctuated by conflict, tragedy, persecution, but also one of the most profound gifts that anybody, any people could get. And that's sort of the connection, not sort of, that is the connection to history and responsibility for the future. And when I see the gentlemen and women who fought, who persevered, who enabled this chapter of Jewish history to be as successful as it has been and as promising as it looks to be, I can only applaud, salute, and thank you. So, I'm slated to give another 6-week story now on contemporary challenges facing Israel and the Jewish people. I sat down with Rabbi Birkin, sat down with President Feingold, with Dr. Amir Baron, and we thought about topics that would be interesting to the general population. We came up with 6, we could have come up with 3, we could have come up with 7, and I'm certainly not going to run through all of them in this class, but I'm going to touch maybe on a couple of minutes on each of them, and then I want to really also speak about what's interesting to you. So this will be like what we call a trailer in a movie, where instead of an hour class, we'll have like a few minutes on. First, we'll talk about Israel-diaspora relations. When we have, when we salute the colors, the red, white, and blue of the United States of America, we also have the blue and white of Hanukkah. And when we think about Hanukkah and the miracle of Hanukkah, we also think about the contemporary challenges facing Israel from defense, from security. Hanukkah is all about the miracle of light. That's why we light the candles. That's why we celebrate the menorah. I have some other friends, a friend Lou's neighbor with his son Nathaniel walked in. Louis and I were in Israel a couple of weeks ago, and there's a gentleman named Charlie Harari, who you should look this up on H.com. There's a very, very powerful description of Hanukkah focusing on light. And it's true that the sword, we've had to defend ourselves with the sword, but the sword is not the symbol of Hanukkah, it's not the symbol of Judaism. It's a symbol of defense. When the Israeli army came into being, it's called the Israel Defense Forces. We defend ourselves so we can focus on the things that we really want to do. We don't want to be warriors, we don't want to be conquerors. We want to be scholars, we want to be scientists, we want to be philosophers, we want to be productive, we want to build, we want to construct, we don't want to deconstruct, we don't want to destroy. So we'll defend ourselves in order to be able to accomplish those other things. And that's what the men in uniform were able to do for the United States of America, and that's what the men in uniform, I see some veterans of the IDF, they can give their own personal perspectives, and I certainly would be very interested in hearing your stories as well. Israel-diaspora relations is relatively new. Many of you in the room were born before the creation of the modern state, and you remember what it was like to live in a world without Israel. You remember what it was like to live in a world where we were still hoping for a place, and you remember sort of the apogee or the nadir, depending on how you look at things, the height of tragedy in not having a homeland, or the bottom of despair in terms of not having that security and being deported from all the countries in Europe and becoming stateless with no real other sovereign to protect you and no state of Israel to go to. So the real initial Israel, first let's have a big round of applause. We found the birth. Yay! So if you remember, for those of you who remember, it was a very difficult relationship because Israel was a small, fragile, nascent country. In the initial war of independence, it lost nearly 1%. 6,000 soldiers defending Israel out of a population of 650,000. That would be the equivalent of over 3 million Americans. Or because Israel has grown so tremendously, it would be the equivalent of over 80,000 people perishing today to defend the state of Israel. These numbers are staggering, but they're real. And the sacrifice made to enable Israel also created this sense of what we accomplished for Judaism. We now brought into being a state of Israel that's really on the precipice of survival. We need people. We need what they call kibbutz galuyot. We need people to come, the ingathering of the exiles. And there was frustration certainly among the United States and Israel about the difference between dying on the front lines or living in the Golden Medina, where you can get a profession, you don't have to send your sons and daughters to the army. But Ben-Gurion and the leadership of American Jewry at the time found an accommodation where there was going to be support from the diaspora, mostly the United States, also Canada, South Africa, England had relatively wealthy Jewish populations at the time, and they would contribute resources to the nascent state through Israel bonds, which I'm proud to chair here in Florida. That was Israel bonds and German war reparations were Israel's only sources of foreign currency in the 50s, when they had massive challenges building first the tent camps for, now we're talking about the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, maybe the number is 700,000, 750,000. There were at least 800,000 Jews who were evicted, forcibly evicted from Arab lands, repatriated in very large measure in the state of Israel that had no money, no resources, no foreign currency. That's where this miracle stepped up and happened. Even before you had a state of Israel, actually, in this crowd I want to mention Machal. Machal is a Hebrew acronym for Mitnadvei Chutzla, it's volunteers coming from abroad. They were instrumental in the War of Independence. They comprised nearly the entire Air Force. This was another deal that Ben-Gurion, who was a Machiavellian genius, orchestrated in order for this pre-state entity to buy surplus material after World War II that was sitting in, lock boxes and warehouses, but also the people who knew how to use this stuff. But the language of the Israeli Air Force remained English for several years after independence because all the pilots came from Canada, the United States, England, South Africa, could speak Hebrew very well, and yet had an enormous contribution of people who saw cast a giant shadow. Kirk Douglas playing Mickey Marcus. Mickey Marcus was Israel's actually first general, but you had Canadians like Ben Dinkelman and other heroes. 123 Machalnikim died among the 6,000, and over 4,000 participated from 58 countries. The largest contingents came, as you would imagine, from the United States, Canada, and England. But this was really a seminal, critical link in Israel-diaspora relations, and it solidified what we now sort of understand, and that is that the link between Israel and Jewish diaspora is inextricable. And it has sustained Israel meaningfully for 67 years. And as I hope to demonstrate in this talk, it's also now meaningfully sustaining the United States and world Jewry. Not just reciprocally, but I think now it's shifted a little bit. I think if you look at the dynamics between Israel and the United States, the Israeli government is now investing in Jewish education around the world. The Israeli government recognizes that if world Jewry is going to remain relevant than Jewish education, Zionism, the connection between the core country, if you will, and all the other countries, the satellite countries, is indispensable. And the United States has, if you look at population figures, there are approximately 13 million Jews in the world today. Slightly over 6 million live in Israel. We passed that seminal milestone threshold a few years ago. Slightly over 5 million in the United States. Put the two of them together, you get probably 11.25 million Jews, meaning that close to 90% of all the Jews in the world live in two countries. Call it duopolar, bipolar if you want to be funny. But that's it. That's what we have. We have still, relevant communities in Canada and England and Argentina and South Africa and France, but they're dwindling communities. Dwindling fast. Russia used to have an enormous Jewish population. It still has critical mass, but since having close to 3 million Jews during the time of the Soviet Union, there are now a few hundred thousand. Moscow has 80,000 Jews, about the same as Montreal. It's a dwindling community. Many have gone to Israel, some have come here. A lot have gone to Berlin. Berlin actually is the fastest growing Jewish city in the world. Germany is the fastest growing Jewish population in the world, from a very low base, but the numbers are rising. You have 120,000 Jews living in Germany now, most in Berlin, but not all of them. But you look at Birthright. Birthright was a program that I had the privilege of participating in its provenance when I worked for Charles Bronfman in Israel in the late 90s, and he, together with another philanthropist, Michael Steinhardt, thought it'd be a pretty good idea for Jewish kids to be able to see Israel firsthand. That was part of their birthright, part of their patrimony, part of their legacy. And they went. And they went a few thousands, tens of thousands, now hundreds of thousands. And they come back, and they're engaged, and they're inspired. They take their friends, they take their parents. In some cases, take their grandparents. In many of those cases, their parents and grandparents haven't been. So there's a lot of self-selection in terms of who remains affiliated, who next to the, there are a lot of Jewish war veterans who feel like they're war veterans, but don't necessarily feel as connected to their Judaism, as connected to Israel. We're very lucky amongst this group to have that precious combination of affiliation. Lewis's son Nathaniel he's in high school now up in Boca. He's on his way to Israel next year to continue his Jewish studies, but also to enlist in the IDF. That's the legacy of Machal. That's what Mickey Marcus and Ben Dinkelfield and Milt Rosenfeld and all the other heroes from abroad who participated in the War of Independence, that's their legacy, hopefully not in future wars, but in the ongoing need to keep Israel strong. The next talk, the next class in the series will be post-Holocaust Jewish identity. And that's a very difficult one. For those of you who are members of the synagogue, you know this. For those of you who are not yet members of the synagogue, please join. We have a remarkable survivor population. And this isn't in an effort to be competitive, but I think statistically speaking, this may have the largest number of survivor members, but to the extent that statistic is relevant at all, it's not going to be meaningful, unfortunately, in a few years from now, because the survivor population will not be with us forever. And for those of us like me who grew up in a city like Montreal or Jerusalem, you saw a lot of tattoos. You didn't hear the stories yet in the 60s and 70s. People still kept that very quiet. In the 80s, 90s, now Holocaust education has found a voice. There have been important projects like Cloud Lanzmann Shoah, Steven Spielberg obviously chronicling the direct testimony of many survivors. I don't want to say that's relatively new, but it's fleeting. And I remember growing up, I never wanted to go to Germany, I never wanted to go to Poland. It was very important for me not to go to those places. And then a friend of mine told me that they were doing a March of the Living trip in 2005 to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and he wanted to get a young leadership bus. All right. I'm not interested, but go ahead and get a young leadership bus. He goes, well, we'll have a little cocktail reception, you'll meet some people. And I was, 40 at the time, and other people in the room were probably 10 years younger on average. late 20s, early mid-30s, and some were actually, also in their later 30s, early 40s. What amazed me is how little people knew about the Holocaust. They thought they were coming to a Jewish singles party and we'll pass out flyers about this opportunity. And I got scared, because then I realized that we're a generation away from the Holocaust being like the Exodus from Egypt. It's a terrible thing, and it impacts who we are, but it's not, who we're going to be. And there's no way to fight that. I did wind up going on the trip, and I worked hard to recruit more people. We wound up getting 3 buses. It was an amazing experience, once in a lifetime. I have no interest in going back, but I think it's important for everybody to see. And the March of the Living series has been a seminal part of Jewish education, also in Israel, but not only in Israel. And when people make the connection between the creation of the State of Israel from the ashes of the Holocaust, they're wrong about that. I don't think that that's a legitimate connection, but temporally they took place very close in time. Holocaust ended in 1945. European Jewry went from about 9 million to 3.5 million. And world Jewry went from close to 18 million to a smidgen over 12 million. It was devastating. It was absolutely devastating. But the State of Israel had been in the works since the late 1880s with the Lyon Roth movement. I think the Holocaust in many ways may have delayed the establishment of the State of Israel. But in the end, and certainly it's tragic to think about what could have happened if Israel predated what may have never been a Holocaust, had those two milestones in Jewish history been reversed. But what I'm saying is that we and our progeny should be prepared to think about Jewish identity differently than the way it was defined for a meaningful portion of the second half of the 20th century. And we're doing it. And I think that one of the ways that we're doing it is thinking about Israel's role in the world and our, Jewish people's role in the world through the accomplishments, successes, and challenges of the State of Israel. We'll have a class dedicated to nuclear ambiguity, nuclear opacity, now with Iran on the horizon and all the talks that have happened, haven't happened, may happen, the political ramifications of Israel holding an election now when there's another timeline before June 30th is very interesting. I think it weakens Israel. For those of you who were here Sunday night, you may have heard of Pastor John Bolton address the crowd. We spent some time together before his remarks. He's troubled about the timing of the election, but it's not his choice. Israel's going to be distracted over the next 3 months, and then another month or 6 weeks before you get to put together a coalition. We'll talk about that at the end today. So it's a real issue. Israel, I'm not here to make an announcement whether it does or doesn't have nuclear weapons, but Israel certainly perceived to be a nuclear state, and that perception had a meaningful impact on Israel's ability to do things and Israel's ability not to do things. For those of you looking forward to that class, I'll give you one vignette. We'll talk about what happened in the Yom Kippur War. People look at the relationships between American presidents and Israeli prime ministers. And now people, if you sort of have to lump Nixon into one category, he was an anti-Semite who saved Israel because he authorized the airlift that provided the weapons necessary to turn the Yom Kippur War around. That's sort of what happened. That's not all that happened. On the third day of the Yom Kippur War, Golda Meir, who was then prime minister, actually ordered that the nuclear weapons that they may or may not have had be trained on Cairo and Damascus. And that message was relayed to the U.S. government. So, I don't think it's completely, I think it would be naive not to think that there might be a relationship between the alacrity of those weapons systems arriving where they had to arrive and knowledge that the other option was on the table. By the way, Europe, and I'm not here to disparage an entire continent, but Europe was completely out to lunch. When the Americans actually asked any European country if they can land and refuel the cargo planes bringing over this material, they all said no. Ultimately, they arranged to land in the Azores. But, Europe just keeps being Europe. And there's some countries a little better, some countries a little worse. But Israel, by the way, the irony is that even before all those weapons arrived, the tide of the war had changed, had shifted. So between day 3 and day 5, 6, when those weapon shipments arrived, Israel had, if you think about it, October 6th to October 8th were the worst. October 8th, the shipment was authorized. By the 9th or 10th of October, we were already doing a lot better. Another class I'm going to talk about is Israel's Israel's economic miracle, right? For those of us who go back, you don't have to go back to the 40s, 50s, or 60s, in the 70s. Do you know what Israel's greatest export was? Think of Israel exports. Go back to the 70s, 80s. An orange, a chapel orange. So we export chapel. It was Holy Land, Fanta. It was the most visible orange, but no, I think we still export chapel oranges, but it's not a blip on the radar screen. Israel's exports now represent an unbelievable percentage of Israel's overall economy, because Israel is a very small country. And Israel has no regional trading partners, right? I mean, if you think about an Argentinian who wants to export something, he can put it in his car and drive to 5 countries that border Argentina. If you're a Frenchman, you can put that item in your car and you can drive to 8 bordering countries. In Israel, there's only one place you can drive: the airport. You get on a plane and take your stuff by sea. Look at Israel's neighbors: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. This is really borders close enough. They're going to trade with Israel. From an intra-regional trading standpoint, Israel might as well be on Mars. And that's not going to change for a very long time. The Middle East, in and of itself, has the lowest rate of intra-regional trade than any other region in the world, lower than Africa, because a lot of these countries hate each other, which is, whatever they have, the only thing that anybody has that some other country might need is oil if they're one of the impoverished regional countries that didn't have oil. Like Jordan seems to have gotten a pretty bad deal on natural resources, and it's hurting them. And we can talk about that in the Q&A in terms of how economic struggles in Turkey and Egypt and Jordan are going to have geopolitical ramifications for Israel. Israel's economy, thank God, is better than it ever was. And a lot of that is attributable to what people call the peace dividend. I was living in Israel in the mid-late 1990s. Got there right after Oslo signed in September of 93, and the treaty with Jordan in October of 94. And countries who heretofore were not doing any business with Israel were tripping all over themselves to come and trade and set up shop, and they were enthusiastic. And you put together the U.S. loan guarantees, the influx of so many qualified, trained people from the former Soviet Union, and the perception of peace, you had this great dividend. A great dividend that enabled countries to make stuff that other people would buy. It couldn't be any product and not at any price, but if it was competitive, we'd be able to find a market. Israel's still a very small country, but India, China, Japan, South Korea, none of these countries did any trade with Israel 20 years ago. Now they are, next to the United States and a couple of countries still in Europe, Israel's most meaningful trading partners. 20 years is a blip, and that transformation has been incredible. The question is, how resilient is it? How resilient is it if we move from a peace dividend to a lack of peace tax? At what point then is the threat of sanctions or the threat of an erosion in international support among key countries that matter a threat to this economic miracle that we're all very proud of? And to what extent is Israel's own internal domestic challenge a threat to that economic viability as well? And there are many. There's the Arab-Jewish conflict. The one that I'm going to talk about in course number 5 is the Orthodox secular conflict. I've argued that in any country, and I'll take this up, during questions and answers, social cohesion is a national security imperative in any country at any time. If you look at countries where you don't have domestic tranquility, as is written in our Constitution, you're going to have social unrest, and if you have social unrest, you are going to be a weaker country. And Israel has miraculously staved off so many natural threats to social cohesion. There's a question as to whether this can be sustained indefinitely. The only reason I'm optimistic is because the track record is so good. But if you look at the vectors, and if you look at the parameters and ingredients that are in this soup, it looks very frothy. And it's not something that I think can be ignored. Because you have a growing of two very large segments of the Israeli population that are largely disenfranchised from political life, from social life, from cultural life, and from the economic life of the rest of the country. Haredi, ultra-Orthodox men and Arab women don't work. It's not like they work a little. I mean, obviously, a few of them work in the black market economy, but they're not part of the mainstream workforce. And I'm happy that the Haredi community is growing at a much faster rate than the Arab Israeli community in terms of birth rates, but it doesn't make the social pressures go away. If anything, it makes addressing those social pressures much more imperative. And in the actual class, in a few weeks from now, we can talk about the draft law, we can talk about other very noble initiatives that have tried to integrate those sectors of the population, particularly the Haredi population, particularly Haredi women. I'm proud and feel privileged to participate in an initiative where we set up vocational training centers for ultra-Orthodox women many of whom have English language skills, to do what a paralegal would do. They drop their kids off at school whenever they do, and they'll sit in this place in front of a computer screen from 8 to 4 and review documents, review leases, review things, and the time zone differential actually works to their advantage. This isn't going to move the economic needle of Israel's sort of GDP meaningfully in any direction, but optically I think it sends a very strong signal that they're prepared to participate in the future of the Israeli economy, and they don't really want to live off the public dole indefinitely. Because I think it's an absolutely cataclysmic danger to have a perpetual underclass, whether it's the Arab Israelis or the Haredi population, because the penchant for populism is real. You know, Israel has 16 parties in the current Knesset, which brings us now to the upcoming election. You know, I don't want to, it's not my role to say whether Prime Minister Netanyahu was right or wrong to call elections. He had the choice, and he made that choice. He wasn't forced into it. He had some challenging coalition partners, as every Israeli government will. The last class will talk about the political relationship between Israel and the United States. Whatever I say today, I can tell you with confidence, will be stale in 2 months from now when we talk about it closer still to the then very upcoming Israeli election. That'll be the last class is February 20th, and the election's on March 17th. Israelis are used to going to the polls, but they didn't want to go to the polls now. I mean, nobody really feels like there's some real burning issues that need to have another referendum on where we go from here. It's really just about a bunch of egomaniacal coalition partners who couldn't get along. But you're always going to have that. You're always going to have that in a parliamentary system. With such diffuse participation among parties, you're always going to have a situation where someone's not going to be happy, someone's going to threaten to bolt, somebody's going to get too big for their britches, somebody's not going to like it, and you're going to have an opportunity to go back and get a stronger mandate. But it's a risk, right? People talk about the lurch to the right, the movement towards the center. Wherever you are on the Israeli political spectrum, I think you want, for the most part, things to get done. And it's so ironic to see who become kingmakers, right? Avigdor Lieberman was famous for being a right-wing bully who left Likud because it wasn't right-wing enough for him, and who was gainsaying all of Sharon's initiatives, and when Sharon broke off to start Kadima, He, had his own sort of entrenched way of looking at the world. Right now, he's on record, even today, if you read the Israeli newspapers, the English language translations of those Israeli newspapers, he's arguing for pragmatism. He says we've got autism and fanaticism, we need pragmatism. Those are the same words in Hebrew. So that's what he's agitating for, which makes him a natural ally of the Livni, Bushi Herzog, sort of maybe Moshe Kahlon, a little bit ambiguous where he winds up. But if the center really got together, not with another new fringe party, but really got together and delivered a platform. If you go back to Newt Gingrich, who I think, by the way, is the father of partisan dissent, certainly in my generation, which is not been politically sentient. But I do remember one of the first things I remember 20 years ago, I came up with this contract for America, which was just, this is it. You like it or you don't like it, but we have talking points on what we want to do, where we want to go, and how we expect to get there. I think if the center in the Israeli public domain puts together a multiple point plan on the domestic and foreign policy issues that are most pressing today, they will rally a very broad consensus around that plan. Because I think that's what Israelis feel is demanding. I think that your average Israeli, even someone who's a big fan of Prime Minister Netanyahu, is frustrated by the fact that we feel like we're being pushed in and bullied into doing things that we may really want to do, but we never really said we really want to do it. So if we ever wind up doing it, it doesn't feel like we really wanted to. And that doesn't project the kind of leadership, including regional leadership, that a lot of Israelis feel there's an opportunity for. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu can do that. I mean, he can do that too. It's his job to lose. He is the incumbent Prime Minister of the State of Israel. He has the power of the office to come up with his plan. And I'd like to see it. He is a bright, articulate, strategic thinker. I'd be very, as somebody who's been following this for very, very many years, I would be very curious to see what he came up with and see what Herzog and Livni came up with. And I don't think you're going to see a lot of interference here in the United States. And I'm not an apologist for this administration. I'm not an apologist for the Israeli government. I'm just here to share with you my own perspectives. I think the Israelis are going to be allowed to make their own decisions. I don't think you're going to see President Obama invite candidates like Yair Lapid or Bushi Herzog or Tzipi Livni to the White House or go on a tour with them to donors or cities, even though he feels that's about what Prime Minister Netanyahu did with Governor Romney in 2012. But it's not going to be payback time. It's going to be let the Israelis vote in whatever government they want. But this is happening during a very precarious time. While we speak, centrifuges are still spinning, and the weaponization program is still going on, and Iran still has its eye on its prize. And I think that a distracted Israel that's preoccupied with an election is not in a position to do what it could be doing. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu deserves credit for really elevating the Iranian nuclear issue on the international stage. I would think that during certainly these last two terms as Prime Minister, that would be his most impressive foreign policy achievement. And he should get credit for that. But he's not going to be able to say a word about this. He's actually on record saying that I'm not going to say the Israeli government will not interfere with the leadership of the United States until this upcoming June 30th deadline. For obvious reasons, he doesn't want to be perceived as going head-to-head with the President of the United States. He's not going to get any credit for that. So I want to wrap up and give you an opportunity to ask questions. But I'm an optimist. And I'm proud to have the ability to think about these issues, to speak about these issues. I took a shortcut coming up Biscayne Boulevard, and at the Fresh Market Mall, you had hundreds of family members, a lot of kids, a lot of parents, just lighting Hanukkah. They're doing it up in Gulf Stream. They're doing it up at other, shopping centers, community centers, schools. It's great. And it's great to be here in South Florida where that's happening, but it's happening in New York, and it's happening in Los Angeles, and it's happening in Toronto, it's happening in Montreal. It's happening all across North America. If this was happening in France, in Paris, England, London, there would be much more of a security concern. We're extremely lucky to be living in this country. We're extremely lucky to be living in this country as Americans, as Jews, as members of the community. And I think just looking at the colleagues here, the pride they have when they wear their hats, when they salute the colors, when they congregate episodically to recognize one another, the friendship that has been cultivated over the years. Nothing makes me prouder, and I have a lot of opportunity to speak on multiple occasions. Nothing makes me prouder, and every time you'll invite me, it will be a privilege to come back. Thank you very much.